All right. So, good morning, Pak Yasir, Prof. Siti, Bu Christine, and Bu Yanti, and well, Melody. So, my name is Aditya Pradipta, and today I will be presenting my thesis titled "Critical Discourse Analysis on Gak Bisa Bahasa Inggris: A Case Study on Twitter." So, firstly, when we are talking about the English language, studies on English have often emphasized on its communicative effectiveness in intercultural communication, or its efficacy as a tool of identity formation in an ever expanding world. Now, of course, by ever expanding, this refers to globalization and how nations are beginning to be very interconnected. And so, of course, these different nations will have different social configurations. Now, in the case of Indonesia, in addition to what has been said above, English is also, it can be considered as a marker of social class and education within the social configuration. So, according to Holland, um, often the issue is not in the entity of the language itself, but how it is reflected within the social configuration it has entered into. So, this is where a potential problem can lie therein, where there can be a potential conflict in the sense that the entity itself and the social configuration and how they can be structurally different. So previous studies about English mostly are usually focused on, they're usually set in schools or universities, or for example, the previous studies about Jaksel English, which has been a discourse since about 2018. They only focus on the translingual aspect. So Jaksel English here refers to code switching and code mixing. And this will be referenced sometimes in the presentation of this thesis. And so this brings us today, of course, to the current case study about this meme, the Gak Bisa Bahasa Inggris meme. Some of you may already be familiar with it. So for example, when someone is speaking in English and someone who may not speak English responds to whatever they are saying with this meme in order to mock them or to invalidate what they are saying. Now, the current case study will focus on the Twitter thread by a Twitter user named Resi. So Resi here said that he didn't like the Gak Bisa Bahasa Inggris meme, and he said that the people who use the meme are proud of being unable to use English, and they were being lazy instead of bettering themselves to learn English, and that they were having an inferiority complex. Now, there were many responses to this. Some agreed with Resi and others did not. Now, in lieu of this, of course, for the current study, the research questions are thus: what do the discourses about English use reveal about Indonesians in language conflict? So specifically in the sub-questions, we want to find out how the social actors or the people in the discourse characterize each other and what sort of factors are attributed to their characterization of each other. And secondly, um, we want to find out how language conflicts construct social culture and beliefs of people in terms of speaking English online. And through the sub questions, we can see how the discourse manifests. We want to see how the discourse manifests itself in social reality within the material, the cultural, and the social. And of course, because this is CDA or critical discourse analysis, what needs to be done about the language conflicts that occur online. So let's take a look at previous studies on the issue. So the issue goes back to the recent history of Indonesia and globalization, where English as a language becomes commodified as a status of prestige. Now, as I mentioned before, English does not necessarily need to reflect the ideology of its place of origin, but the problem is often more in the social configuration of Indonesia and how it reflects English. So here English is a language of the governing elite globally. And how does it exactly reflect in Indonesia? This is where language can be seen as a mechanism of power, according to Bourdieu. And however, if we look at it in terms of, oh, people code mix all the time, people use different languages all the time. Yes, of course, according to Chanagaraja, code mixing, code switching, and things like that, that is part of translingualism or translanguaging. This is part of navigating the complex systems of today using an integrated communication system. So on its own, it is normal. But within the context of a social configuration, there could be a potential problem. Now, the potential problems may usually occur in social media, where there can be a loss of boundaries between the personal and the political. So an example of this can be seen in disinterpretation. This is what Alim calls just disinterpretation, which is different from misinterpretation. So with disinterpretation in online discourses, people do not have the intention to understand at all. They willfully misunderstand people and inject their own arguments to what other people are saying. And this is where CDA could play an important role to address these social wrongs, because CDA is a multidisciplinary method, and of course, it uses the existence of several frameworks in order to understand the issue better. Now, previous studies about the issue that are exactly similar to the current study are very, very limited. However, the three previous studies here by Al-Jarala, Wood, and Purnamasari, they compose a profile of a basis for the current study. Now, on to the current study itself. So, the current study focuses on secondary data, which were extracted from a Twitter thread started by Resi. Resi is a web developer and a virtual tuber. And 400 tweets were extracted from the thread. Now, there were more than 400 tweets. However, 400 tweets are the number of tweets that were publicly available. So the tweets that were not publicly available, I was not able to extract them, of course. So this is an example of how I categorize the tweets. So I would copy paste the tweets into Microsoft Excel, and I would mark them according to the needs of the study. So for example, here I code them, or if they contain certain indications that they would refer to certain things in terms of intertextuality or referential nomination strategies. Now, for the data analysis procedure. So the first part of the data analysis procedure focuses on the discourse historical approach by Wodak, which has been adapted by which I adapted from Al-Jarala's thesis. So this is the figure of the study and a general figure of how it is conducted. Now, firstly, what is done here is the top green box here, the referential and nomination strategies. So here, what is seen are the words that are used to refer to one another in the discourse. And the goal is to determine the in-group and out-group categories. And then predicational strategies follows in order to, and what is analyzed are the themes that reappear in the characterization of each other. And the goal is to determine the issues that underlie the opinions within the discourse. And finally, there's intertextuality, which refers to text or references that were used to support the arguments of the social actors. Now, the discourse historical approach will answer the first research question along with its two sub-questions. In order to answer the second research question, a different approach is applied, that is the morphogenetic approach by Newman, which he modified from Fairclough's framework of discourse analysis. So in order to do this, the answers that have been analyzed with the previous question, they're analyzed further to see how the discourse manifests itself in reality and how it shapes reality. And of course, the main framework of the morphogenetic approach will be used. But There are also other frameworks that will be used, such as here the theory of capital and class distinction by Bourdieu, which sees language as a mechanism of power, and translingualism by Chanagaraja, which views language as a complex integrated communication system, and speech acts by Austin and Jones, which view speech as not just speech but containing actions. Now, on to the findings of the current study. So this is firstly, we're going to discuss the general findings. So a majority of the traction comes from the quote retweets and the responses to the quote retweets. And a majority of the tweets were in English and with Indonesian following. And the discourse lasted 5 days, with most of the tweets happening on the second day. And a majority of the tweets disagreed with Resi. So they disagreed with Resi's claim that the people who used the meme had an inferiority complex. They were proud of being unable to speak English, so and so, while only 40 people agreed with Resi. So this is a table of how I categorize, just as an example, how I used it in the thesis. So if you can see, I know it can be a bit small, but I will explain it. So for example, I categorize them as agreeing with Resi if, for example, they use negative words to describe the people Resi are, the people that Resi is arguing against. So it can be inferred there that they agree with Resi, and the reverse is true. If they use negative words about Resi, then we can infer that they disagree with Resi. While for neutral, they have a mixture of opinions. They consider both sides of the argument. While with humor, they don't directly engage with the issue. They use humor and memes to respond to it, while for other, they talk about other things unrelated to the issue. Now, on the discourse historical approach and how they answer the first research question. What do discourses about English use reveal about Indonesians in language conflicts? So firstly, in terms of how they characterize each other in the discourse, it was found that, in terms of referential and nomination strategies, those who used the meme were seen as being proud of being unable to speak English, and they see this as stemming from an inferiority complex. While those who were against the meme, they were considered as being privileged people who showed elitism to others. And to answer the second sub-question of what sort of factors are attributed to the characterization of the social actors, in predicational strategies, it was found that the issue was they were perceived as projecting their inferiority complex, and they were considered as being ignorant of the world, while those who were against the meme were perceived as projecting their superiority complex, and they were being insensitive to issues of education and access. And then in intertextuality, the general thing that occurred was the systemic issue of access and education that was brought up several times. While on a smaller scale, the issue that most people had was with Resi's personal conduct in the thread. So let's take a closer look at these aspects. So for example, with the meme users, the most occurring lexemes were proud and inferiority. Other negative terms did occur to describe the meme users, but there were also positive terms that characterized the meme users as people who were being grateful, who were being humble, who were expressing their class anxieties through the meme. While those who were against the meme, the two most occurring words were privilege and fafifu. So fafifu refers to the phrase fafifu was, which refers to when people speak complicatedly about things. More negative terms occurred when describing those who were against the meme. And some of them are very politically incorrect, so mind those. And the positive terms that occurred with the against the meme group were very small, and mostly they were describing how perhaps the people who were against the meme were tired of the behavior of the people who used the meme. Now, in predicational strategies, as we discussed before, the issue was there was a sense of inferiority complex. They were considered as being proud of being unable to speak English, and they were being lazy. They didn't want to better themselves. That is how the people who were against the meme viewed them, and that they were being ignorant of the state of the globalized world. While for those who were against the meme, they were considered as being insensitive to issues of societal access and the education system, and they were projecting their superiority complex. Now, in intertextuality, these three issues compose rather the general issue here. So the first two, the Trigatra Bangun Bahasa and Pisani's article, so the references regarding these two were mostly about the education system, while for the East Asian countries, the social actors here compared the behaviors of Japanese and South Korean people, fellow Asian nations who do not have English as their first language. They say that, oh, these people don't do the Bisa Bahasa Inggris thing, so why should we do something like that? And something else that occurred in the discourse was the pronouns, references to the pronouns discourse. So Resi put his pronouns on his bio, as a lot of people today do, in order for people to be able to identify them correctly. Now, this is considered as being part of being more liberal or open-minded, and so people who do not like people who are liberal or open-minded often attack people for putting pronouns in their bio. So Resi here was there were several instances of people mentioning his use of pronouns in his bio. And then there were the issue of Resi's translation of the thread and his translation work. And other issues were mostly comparing Resi's behavior compared to other public figures who could have done, who might have done better if they were in Resi's situation. So intertextuality in general did not occur very much, but these were the most occurring text. Now, some discussions. So firstly, it can be inferred that the speech acts that were performed by the social actors, they signify the loss of boundaries between the personal and the political. So Resi's original tweet might be just a personal rant, miso-miso, if you will. And then perhaps because of his significant platform, or perhaps someone with a significant platform interacted with the tweet became viral and people had such strong reactions to those tweets, and thus was born the discourse about language use. And of course, there was the whole discourse of memes and humor as social critique. So the Gak Bisa Bahasa Inggris meme can be considered as a social critique stemming from class anxieties. And Resi's dislike of the meme was considered as weird to the people who criticized him, and that he was being too serious about it. However, the fact remains that there are non-English users who mock English users without much warrant. For example, I believe this happened to Resi. He was merely doing his virtual tube thing and he was speaking in English, and suddenly people started saying "Gak bisa bahasa Inggris, gak bisa bahasa Inggris" as a joke. And this is where we can start to ask the question in reverse. And there is still the notion that English speakers are superior within these people. Now, we can see this in the discourse of the Bahasa Jaksel phenomena, which has been discussed since 2018. And we can see that some previous studies discussed the people who use the Jaksel English or code switching as being bullied online. Now, we should ask the question then, if being able to speak English means that you have a certain societal privilege, can you be discriminated if you are not systematically oppressed? So this is where comes the question that whether English is just a language or whether or not it is a mechanism of power, as Bourdieu would put it. Now, that answers the first research question and its two sub-questions. In order to answer the second research question, we focus on the morphogenetic approach. So for the first sub-question, we will focus on social reality. I will illustrate this and explain this in a figure in a bit. While for the second sub-question, what is important here is what is considered here is the role of important social actors, and that more research needs to be done about this, which will be brought up also in a while. So this is something that's called the morphogenetic cycle by Newman. So here in the gray little circle, the social actors of the thread, this can be Resi or anyone else in the thread. So for example, we can say this is Resi. And in terms of material structure, Resi lives in Jakarta. Jakarta is Resi's material structure. And then cultural structures. So these material structures are located within cultural structures. And this consists of, for example, Resi's beliefs about language or his ability to speak English or Indonesian. And these collections of cultural structures create social structures of fellow Indonesians or fellow web developers and things like that. And people belong in different structures. Now, when Resi tweets something, this is called a material practice. And when the tweet talks about his beliefs about language or he uses those languages, he's performing cultural practice. And when he is making a social practice, he is making a statement, for example, on public social media accounts. And these practices affect the overall structure on the whole. And this is what creates change and reproduction or agency. Now, how exactly does change and reproduction happen? So I showed this chart that I made to Newman, who made the theory, and he suggested that I check out the works of Elder Voss and Archer. And so I did. So we'll start with this, with another figure, and we'll start with something that we're already familiar with, the structure. Now, the structure conditions the social actors within those structures to behave and believe certain things. And on their own, they have something that's called resultant properties, abilities that are not unique. However, together, these social actors form an emergent entity. And together, this emergent entity possesses emergent properties, which ensures what Archer calls as emergence, which ensures change. Now, here, Elder Voss, in discussing Archer's work, said that Archer mostly focuses on the diachronic aspect, that is morphostasis or maintenance of the morphogenetic cycle, or morphogenesis or change of the morphogenetic cycle. What needs to be focused on future studies on discourse, according to Elder Voss, is the synchronic aspect. This is considered as a crucial aspect. The role of important parts, important social actors, so to speak, who perhaps on their own may have emergent properties. And this may significantly boost the abilities of social actors who can only have power if they are in a mass. And this is what ensures the balance of morphogenesis and morphostasis in order for structural change to happen. So we can see this in this next chart. We're already familiar with this chart before. And if the same practices are done, then this would result in morphostasis, in maintenance of the same structure. And this would condition the social actors to behave the same way as the cycle goes on and on and on. However, if the social actors perform practices that are fundamentally different from the norm, then morphogenesis might happen. So we can see this as answering the first and the second research sub-question. So, of course, they manifest in these realities. So Resi is a social actor, and he's in Jakarta, and he has certain beliefs about the languages. And societal change can happen by people like Resi and the people who responded to his thread. They make a difference by performing the discourse. So some discussions. So, of course, the question here is about power. Now, sweeping conclusions, for example, about Resi, it was made because Resi spoke as an English speaker, and so he represented English speakers. This is what Bourdieu said about a mechanism of power. He represented his structure, and this is why some sweeping conclusions can be made. And in order for any change to happen, it requires actions that deviate from the norm, because it may change the structure fundamentally. And here we can see that language is a pertinent aspect of social reality. It drives people. It is, perhaps I can say, the blood of discourse, because when these people talk, they perform certain actions, they do certain things. And often conflicts happen because these people are interacting from structures that are fundamentally misaligned, and thus this triggers adverse reactions. So what can we do about this? So, of course, because this is a systemic issue, based on what has been discussed before, we cannot rely on the system to reform itself. A more grassroots approach needs to be done about this. in order to dispel existing myths on language use. So this is where the role of important social figures, whether it's scholars or public figures or perhaps even social media influencers or anyone who can drive those opinions forward in order to dispel those existing myths. But of course, this requires consensus among experts. So, for example, on the Jaxel discourse, Ivan Lanin said, "Oh, it's bad to code mix," while Ritwan Said said, "Oh, it's good to code mix." But people don't really know, for example, where does this phenomenon come from, and why is there so much conflict about it? Now, onto the conclusions of the presentation of the current study. We can see that language conflicts can occur very easily among Indonesians on social media, and that in terms of discourses of language conflicts, these social actors, they characterize each other in ways that set themselves apart, and that preconceived ideas about power, inferiority, superiority, things like that, they potentially root in class anxieties, and they condition social actors to behave in certain ways and thus reproduce certain beliefs about society. And of course, there's the whole issue of access and education, and there is an underlying systemic issue, and perhaps these class anxieties stem from that very thing. And that the discourse manifests itself in social reality, and they shape it through the morphogenetic cycle, through discourse. And that the role of important figures need to be considered for conflict prevention or management in order to dispel myths and informing the masses about issues of language use. The implications of the current study focuses more research needs to be done on the issue of language conflicts and class anxieties because there's so very little about these studies, and the study would be useful for policymakers, enactors of those policies, and those affected by the policy. So, for example, by the education ministry or by schools and teachers and students to identify potential stumbling blocks in English education. For example, you should just learn English. Why can't these people just learn? Why can't they just be better? The reality is not that simple, but the people in the discourse say such things. Now, for the current study, the limitations, unfortunately, there is very much a lack of previous studies theoretically. And the current study lacks in depth of analysis. The current study does not focus on a specific framework. And for example, for speech acts, does not even discuss what sort of speech acts specifically occur or the important role of humor or memes here. And suggestions for future studies would focus more on social media and discourse studies, the use of memes and social media to give socio-political critique, and the types of speech acts associated with memes, so that in order to identify when these conflicts happen, because based on the findings, humor was actually rather significant, but unfortunately, it was not the point of the current study. And I believe that's all for the current presentation. These are some of the references that were used, and thank you.